So today in my talk, I want to address a kind of elephant in the room, which is the fossil record. Doesn't the fossil record prove Darwin right? That's what you often hear in online comments. Archaeopteryx and transitional fossils, they have proven Darwin. So all the arguments against Darwinism must be wrong. We have the evidence. Is this really true when we look at the fossil record? Actually, the fossil record doesn't show really this continuum of development. It shows discontinuities. It shows explosions in the fossil record, abrupt appearances. And that is quite well known. You see here a quote by one of the founders of modern evolutionary theory, Ernst Mayr, who said, we find discontinuities everywhere in biology, and they are especially evident in the fossil record. And another famous scientist, Stephen Jay Gould, said it's a kind of trade secret of paleontology, these kind of discontinuities and abrupt appearances, which are unexpected. So why is this a problem? Now, every theory does, or at least should, make certain empirical predictions that can be tested with real-world data. And where you can see is the theory really conforming with real-world data, then it's good for the theory, or the real-world data conflicting with the predictions of the theory, and then you should maybe rethink your theory. And actually, there are problems, and the problem arises by a prediction from evolutionary theory which is called gradualism. And gradualism means that big changes are explained by an accumulation of many small changes over long periods of time. And it's not for nothing that Charles Darwin, in his magnum opus, made a quote from a Latin sentence 5 times, which is natura non facit saltus, nature doesn't make jumps. And the reason is that Darwin wanted to explain the history of life with a totally naturalistic process. And he was quite aware that saltations, discontinuities would require some kind of miraculous interventions. And so it's not just an artifact of the history of evolution from Darwin's time. Even if we look at modern proponents of Darwinism like Richard Dawkins, maybe the most famous popularizer of Darwinism, he said evolution not only is a gradual process as a matter of fact, it has to be gradual if it is to do any explanatory work. Which means if we find that the fossil record or other data are not gradual, then it's a problem for the theory. It's not just some side issue. So Steve Meyer has written about Darwin's doubt, and it's called Darwin's doubt because Darwin was quite aware of the problem. He wrote, well, we don't find this continuity in the fossil record, and that this could be called one of the biggest obstacles, one of the biggest problems facing his theory. And he tried to explain this inconvenient fact away with a kind of rescue device, and the rescue device is, well, the fossil record is incomplete and we didn't find everything, it's just gaps of knowledge. So probably it was gradual, but we just don't find the gradualism in the preserved data. But actually, when we look 100 years later, and one of the followers of Darwin, another famous founder of modern evolutionary theory, George Gaylord Simpson, arguably one of the most prominent paleontologists of the 20th century, he said on occasion of the 100 years after Darwin, it is a feature of the known fossil record that most taxa appear abruptly. They are not, as a rule, led up to by a sequence of almost imperceptibly changing forerunners, such as Darwin believed should be usual in evolution. This should be expected according to the theory. The peculiarities of the fossil record pose one of the most important theoretical problems in the whole history of life. And this shows this is not a problem we are making up. This is a problem that is acknowledged by the experts. And when people tell you there is no problem, there is no debate, that is simply not true, as you see from quotes of some honest scientists who really know the data and admit the problems in the data. Now, the common cop-out, of course, is the incompleteness of the fossil record, and you say, well, gaps of evidence are just gaps of evidence and not evidence of gaps. That's a quote from a famous paleontologist who made this as a kind of variation of our other famous saying by Carl Sagan. But is this really plausible? We can actually test this. And the way how this can be tested has been illustrated very beautifully by an analogy by my friend and colleague Paul Nelson. And he said, imagine you have a new hobby, and the hobby is beachcombing. You walk along the shore and you collect what the flood washes in, and you find every day something new. You find new starfish, new mussels, new shells, maybe a piece of driftwood, and after many years of collecting, maybe a message in a bottle. But the longer you do this hobby, you find more and more stuff that you have discovered before, and repetition sets in. Ultimately, you reach a point where you only find stuff that you have found before, and then you know that you have sampled enough to know what you have found is what can be found out there, and what you haven't found, you didn't find because you didn't look hard enough, but because it's not out there, or at least cannot be washed in by the flood. So this very same principle is actually used by mainstream paleontology to test the completeness of the fossil record. And there it is called the collector curve. And if you look at this illustration, you can imagine a kind of visualization where you have an x-axis where you can plot the effort that you have to invest to find new fossils. And you can measure this effort however you want. You can measure it in terms of man-hours you have to invest in digging fossils, or in grant money, or energy, whatever you prefer. And in the y-axis, you plot the number of newly discovered fossil taxa, new fossil groups. And in the beginning, the curve is steep, which means you don't have to invest a lot of time and money to find interesting new stuff. But ultimately, the curve flattens, and then you know that you have reached this point of saturation where remaining gaps are real signal of nature, and not just an artifact of undersampling. And this test is applied in many groups of organisms, and we know that the fossil record is sufficiently complete to say these gaps in the fossil record, these discontinuities are real. They are not an artifact of the incomplete fossil record. So, for example, if we look at terrestrial vertebrates, at tetrapods, four-legged animals, more than 80% of them, of the living families, are represented in the fossil record. And you can extrapolate this on other groups on all different time horizons. On the family level, we have about an 80% completeness in the fossil record at all times in all groups. And of course, you have to distinguish the hierarchical level you look at. If you look at the lowest level, let's say the species level, there, of course, the fossil record will always be highly incomplete, because there have been estimated that maybe less than 1% of all species that ever existed have been preserved as fossils at all. But that's not what you're really interested in when you look at macroevolution. How did birds come about, or how did feathers originate, or multicellular animals? There you are interested in the larger categories. So we have to look at the completeness of the fossil record on, let's say, the family level and above. And on this interesting level for macroevolution, the fossil record is sufficiently complete that we can really make distinctive statements about the question, is there continuity or is there discontinuity? So in the following talk, I will show you some of the surprising abrupt origins of different groups. And when I say abrupt, and then you will see, well, that happened within 5 or 10 million years. You may think, well, 5 or 10 million years sounds like a lot of time in human terms. There can happen a lot of stuff in 5 or 10 million years. But to show you, to give you a little bit of an impression how short this time is in biological terms and in geological terms, you can look at the longevity of an average species. And what you see here are data from mainstream textbook wisdom. That is not what we say, that is what mainstream evolutionary biology says, is that depending if you look at invertebrates, marine animals, or terrestrial and land animals, or plants or whatever, you have average lifespans that vary between 2.5 and 10 million years. That's about the time a species exists from its origin, the time it exists until its extinction or dissolution into something else, whatever model of species you apply. But taking the average species model, that's the time of existence of a single species. So when you have an origin of a new body plan, a totally new construction within a 5 to 10 million year window of time, this means that is equal to the time of the existence of just one or two successive species, which gives you an impression this is pretty quick for having such a major re-engineering, transforming a pig-like assumed ancestor into an assumed dolphin-like descendant or something else. So let's look at the fossil record, what we find. And where do we start? We start at the beginning, at the origin of life. And at the very beginning, before the origin of life, we have an event in Earth history that made basically sustainable life in the oceans impossible. That event is called the Late Heavy Bombardment, which was a time when there were dozens of large impactors. And with large impactors, I mean asteroids, not the size that extinguished the dinosaurs, but 10 times or even more the size of those asteroids. And there have been calculations in mainstream papers, even until recently, 2014, in Nature, that at this time, several times, all the oceans of the Earth were evaporated by these events, which means the oceans couldn't sustain life at this time. And if life existed before, it was extinguished and had to be recreated, had to reappear again. So when do we find the first life? The late heavy bombardment was 4.1 till 3.8 million years ago, and it ended 3.8 million years ago. And when do we find the first evidence for life? Not billions of years of chemical evolution later, but at the very first time in Earth history where life could be sustained in the oceans, you find the first reliable evidence for life, which is dated to 3.77 billion years ago. There are some controversial fossils which have been dated to 4.1 billion years ago, but even most experts think that they are unorganic in origin and are not really fossils of microbes. So we find life at the very beginning. That's surprising because life is complex, and we find evidence there for bacteria which have already the cell with all this machinery that a cell requires. That should happen, if at all, by a natural process after hundreds or thousands of millions of years, and not at the very first moment where life could be sustained in the oceans. And with the first life, we not just find very simple metabolism, very simple physiology, but we find one of the most complex processes that is visible in life at all, which is photosynthesis, which requires very complex proteins. You see here a model of the protein that is involved in one of the processes of photosynthesis. And the very first organisms that we find almost 3.8 billion years ago are cyanobacteria, which were the first organisms that had photosynthesis. And we do not only find fossils of those microbes where you might say, well, it's controversial, maybe they had photosynthesis, maybe not, but we also find the biochemical markers in the fossil record that document that photosynthesis was happening at this time. And you find evidence for even oxygen produced by photosynthetic processes by these organisms at this very early time in Earth history. So why did this happen so early? Not after hundreds, millions of years of evolution to produce such complex proteins. Where did the information come from? And the next event is not yet the Cambrian explosion. We have another explosion before, and that explosion has been called the Avalon explosion. Avalon is the name of a hypothetical reconstructed supercontinent that supposedly existed at this time. And what we find there in a time window of about 500, so let's say 570 million years ago, is the so-called Ediacaran biota. And I say biota because nobody really knows what these things are. These are the first fossils that even a layman would recognize as fossils, not just tiny bubbles that may have been bacteria, but really macroscopic, larger fossil organisms. But we don't know what they were, if they were plants, animals, fungi, giant protists. They have a strange symmetry. They have a glide symmetry. Left and right side are shifted against each other, not mirror symmetrical like we are. We can make a line through the middle of the body, and left and right are more or less equal. They have a strange kind of reproduction, of fractal growth. They have a kilted structure like an air mattress. They have no visible organs. They look like aliens, basically. They appear out of nothing. We don't find precursors in the preceding layers, which could have preserved that there are also sandstone layers, like the sandstone layers where we find these fossils from previous times. There are no precursors there. They appear out of nothing. They go extinct at the end of the Ediacaran period, which is the last period prior to the famous Cambrian explosion. And they are certainly not the precursors of the animals of the Cambrian explosion. These are not metazoan animals, some kind of pre-arthropods or pre-worms or pre-mollusks. They are something totally different, and we have no idea what they were. And then we come to the Cambrian explosion, which you probably all have either read or at least have heard about the book by Steve Meyer, Darwin's Doubt, about the Cambrian explosion and the origin of animal body plans. And in the Cambrian, and that is about around about 530 million years ago, we find a sudden appearance of different construction of animals, like the mollusk body plan, the arthropod body plan, the vertebrate body plan. More than 20 different phyla, phyla is this name for these different categories of body plans of animals, appear again without precursors in the preceding layers. They are there, fully developed with all their typical structure, and this has been called life's Big Bang, as you see in here one of the Time magazine cover titles. This, of course, was a quite inconvenient finding, because that is not at all what you expect based on Darwinian evolution, that you find all this complexity arising out of nowhere. And even Richard Dawkins said it looks like it was planted there without any evolutionary history. So how do you explain this? The common explanation was the so-called artifact hypothesis, which said, well, there were no suitable layers like the layers in the Cambrian, the famous Burgess Shale, where these small, soft-bodied organisms could be preserved. There were no such layers in the Ediacaran, and therefore we didn't find these organisms. They're precursors. It's just there are geological reasons. And this argument was reasonable for a while, but in the past decades we have discovered so-called Burgess Shale type localities, dozens of them from the Ediacaran, which means we have localities like the famous Cambrian Burgess Shale from the Canadian Rocky Mountains, where all these Cambrian animals from the Cambrian explosion were found. The same sedimentological structure, the same preservational capabilities. They could have preserved soft-bodied organisms with nervous system and with everything. They could have preserved small organisms. We know dozens of these localities now from the Ediacaran, and there's nothing but algae there. And some problematic organisms, but none of the Cambrian animal phyla. And two of the most famous examples are the Lantian biota from China and the Sunarts biota from Mongolia. And this has been basically admitted by mainstream scientists that there are no animals there. So the artifact hypothesis is refuted by mainstream data. Now, another explanation to explain away the Cambrian explosion by some critics of Steve Meyer's book was the appeal to the so-called small shelly fauna. The small shelly fauna are small fossils, fragments of exoskeletons, of echinoderms, and of arthropods, and of other animals with hard parts, small tiny fragments of them that are found in the lower Cambrian. And then in this graph, you see here's the border between this horizontal line between the Cambrian and the prior Ediacaran. You have a lot of those small shelly faunas in the Cambrian, but then there is a small red line showing there are also some from the Ediacaran. And the claim was, well, these were the rare precursors of the Cambrian animal phyla. Now, actually, this whole argument is based on a fallacy, and it's a fallacy of equivocation, because these two small shelly faunas from the Cambrian and from the Ediacaran, the only thing they have in common is the name. They have been both called small shelly faunas. What we find in the Cambrian is just the fragments of Cambrian animals, echinoderms, arthropods, as I said. What we find in the Ediacaran are totally different organisms, basically only two genera, Namapoikia and Cludinia. Both are highly controversial. Most experts think that they were some kind of coelenterids, so related to corals and jellyfish. So not bilateral metazoan animals like the animal phyla of the Cambrian explosion. Certainly not the precursors of the Cambrian explosion. So this argument simply fails because these two small shelly faunas have nothing in common. Another argument was more plausible until recently, and that was an argument from the trace fossil record. So in the fossil record, we not only find fossils from whole body organisms, from dead animals or dead other organisms, but we also find fossils of their traces from footprints where they were walking or crawling on the seafloor, or burrows from burrowing organisms. And we know from the Cambrian, it's also called the Cambrian substrate revolution, a very diverse set of trace fossils of complex burrows deep into the marine, in the sea bottom. But nothing like this from the Ediacaran. But from the Ediacaran, there were found very simple traces only on the surface of the seafloor. And it was said, and that was reasonable, well, these traces, they could be the more simple precursors of the animals of the Cambrian explosion. But again, something happened, and that was a paper by Mariotti et al. A few years ago in 2016. And what Mariotti and his colleagues did is they looked what is typical for the Ediacaran biota, for the ecosystems. And typical for those ecosystems were that the seafloor was basically sealed, covered by microbial mats, by bacterial mats. So what they did is they reconstructed the assumed conditions of the Precambrian sea in aquarium, in fish tanks, and they grew bacterial mats, these microbial mats, in these laboratory conditions. And then they stirred them up and they looked what happened to these bacterial mats, what do you get for kind of shrinking artifacts, folding structures, and so on. So here's an image, the photo you see here from the publication Mariotti. On the left side, you see the original fossils from the Ediacaran, which look like a worm crawling on the seafloor or an arthropod walking along the seafloor. And on the right side, you see the artifactual structures you get from these microbial mats in the experimental conditions. And you see you can one-to-one get the same structures without any animal activity from these artifacts of bacterial mat structures, which showed this is not evidence for animal activity and some kind of continuity from the Ediacaran to the Cambrian. There's nothing convincing there. And there was a second paper that put this evidence into question from another angle, and that is it was discovered that nowadays, living, we have deep-sea protists, large deep-sea protists, unicellular organisms, and they are not all small. There are some of them that can reach several inches in diameter, and they can produce traces on the seafloor that look like the walking or burrowing activity of animals. And you see here on the title of this paper, Giant Deep-Sea Protist Produces Bilaterian-like Traces. So both papers together basically demolished the evidence from the trace fossil record. So this didn't work either to explain away the Cambrian explosion. And finally, I want to give you a little impression that you must be careful when you look at mainstream papers, and especially in the media headlines. And here from this paper, Daly et al. In 2018, there was a headline that was called "The emergence of life on Earth was much slower than previously thought. The Cambrian explosion took 40 million years." Well, that sounds impressive. It was not an explosion. It took 40 million years, much slower than expected. But if you don't look just at the media headlines, but at the actual paper, you find that it proved the exact opposite. So what did they do? This paper looked at the origin of arthropods. And they first looked, when do we find the oldest stem arthropods, the oldest assumed ancestor of arthropods? And they found this 518 million years ago, dated by radiometric dating. Okay, then they looked, when do we find the oldest, more modern arthropods, which have the full set of arthropod characters? And they found it 521 million years ago. Wait a minute, the assumed descendants are 3 million years older than the assumed ancestors. That's a little bit of a problem, but of course, you always have a rescue device. The ancestors must be older than the descendants, so they must have existed before. You construct a so-called ghost lineage, and you just postulate the existence of the ancestors older than the assumed descendants back into the past without fossil record. They just happen to not be preserved, which might be true. We don't know. So they tried, of course, to find a little bit more evidence for this, and they looked at the trace fossil record. And they found trace fossils 37 million years ago. And usually with trace fossils, you have the problem that trace fossils are very unspecific. You just have some imprints, and it's difficult to really attribute these traces to a particular trace-producing organism. But in this case, it was easy. It would have even been easy for undergraduate paleontology students, because the traces they found 537 million years ago are so-called Cruziana and Rusophycus traces, which are resting traces of trilobites. Well, trilobites are fully developed arthropods with compound eyes, exoskeleton, mouth parts, gut system, nervous system, articulated legs, and so on. So they found indirect evidence from the trace fossil record for arthropods 537 million years ago. And then they looked, well, what was before in the Ediacaran? And they looked at what I told you before, these Burgess Shale type localities from Mongolia and China. And the authors explicitly acknowledge there are no animals there, and this means there were no animals, there were no arthropods 550 million years ago. So, what do we make of this? 550 million years ago, no animals, no arthropods, just some goo, some jelly, blob-like supposed proto-animals. And just 30 million years later, 537 million years ago, already trilobites with compound eyes, exoskeleton, nervous system, gut system, articulated legs. That's, just as a reminder, the lifespan of one or two successive marine invertebrate species to make this transition from goo to a trilobite, which is completely ridiculous. So this paper is actually confirming the abruptness, even making it more acute, the abruptness of the Cambrian explosion, and not making it more gradual or even explaining it away. So always be careful with pompous media headlines. So, which of course is not really news. We have fake news in all areas, and it's also in science, because flashy media headlines, of course, better sell newspapers. So the real experts, and here you see a quote by Derek Briggs, who's one of the leading experts on the Cambrian explosion, and he wrote in 2015, we now know that the sudden appearance of fossils in the Cambrian is real and not an artifact of an imperfect fossil record. So when Steve Meyer in his book said, well, the artifact hypothesis is refuted, this is mainstream consensus among the experts, and people who deny this are usually not experts on the Cambrian fossil record. Sorry, that's the remote. So that was the Cambrian explosion, but maybe the Cambrian explosion and the Avalon explosions were exception from the rule. What is if we look at other periods of Earth history? So next period would be the Ordovician. And there in the Ordovician, about 460 million years ago, we have an event that is called the Great Ordovician Biodiversification Event, or GOBI. And you see here a title from a paper from New Scientist called Life's Second Big Bang. So this was the second event after the Cambrian explosion, which was Big Bang-like. And what we find there is, if you look at the graph again, where we have here vertically the biodiversity of families of marine invertebrates and horizontally the time axis, the steep sudden increase of diversity of families of marine invertebrate animals. Life's second Big Bang. And what this also shows is that we find the very opposite of the prediction of the theory. The theory would predict we have an ancestral species. The species is split into two daughter species, which are still very similar. Then they diverge and over time develop into different genera, and over even more time into different families, and after hundreds of millions of years, maybe in different orders or different phyla. But what we actually find is in the Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of these different body plans of the different phyla out of nowhere, and then in the Ordovician afterwards, the diversification into different families. So we find a top-down pattern rather than a bottom-up pattern predicted by evolutionary theory. That should give evolutionists reason to pause if a theory predicts the exact opposite of the empirical data that you find in nature. That should you make rethink your mechanism and your theory. So next event in Earth history would be in the Silurian and Devonian. We just go the geological column up even closer to more recent times, but we are still about 400 million years ago, and we find the so-called Silurian-Devonian terrestrial revolution. These names are not made up by us, by intelligent design proponents. These are the names for this event coined by the evolutionist and mainstream paleontologist scientists, that they are called revolutions or explosions or big bangs of life for a reason. No gradual event is called like that. So what we find here is now the sudden appearance of terrestrial plants. And the earliest terrestrial plants that have been discovered, like Brachymagnatia, which has been discovered from the Silurian in India, they already belong to recent subgroups of plants like liverworts. And you see here a quote from a mainstream paper by Bateman et al. in 98. And he said, Silurio-Devonian radiation of land biotas is the terrestrial equivalent of the much debated Cambrian explosion. So again, the same pattern like the Cambrian explosion we find with the origin of land plants. What is next? In the Devonian itself, about 400 to 410 million years ago, there is an event that has been called by a study friend of mine, by Christian Klug, the Devonian Nekton revolution. And what does this mean? If you're an animal and you live in the sea, you have just three options. You can live close to the seafloor, that is called demersal, and in this graph is shown yellow-brownish. Or you can drift passively in the water column, that is called planktonic way of life, that is green. And you can be an active swimmer like fish or cephalopods, that would be the blue part. So here you have the time axis, here you have the biodiversity, and you see you have a sudden reversal, basically, of the marine ecosystems. Before this event, everything was living to the ground or planktonic. Afterwards, most of the biodiversity were active swimmer. And this happened within 5 to 10 million years. Totally reverse of the biosystems. Where did the information come from to make this change? And correlated with this is the so-called odontode explosion. Again, not a term made up by us, but in the mainstream papers, it's the sudden origin of tooth-like structures in fish-like organisms, which would mean organisms like the shark and ray relationship, the lobe-finned fish and the ray-finned fish, and more or less contemporaneously, we find all these tooth-like structures in the mouth region and on the skin appearing out of nowhere. And in the Devonian, again, there's another event, the Devonian terrestrial revolution, which is, on the one side, the appearance of terrestrial arthropods, first insects, first myriapods, first spider-like organisms, but on the other hand, the first four-legged vertebrate animals on land. And this is so abrupt that it is even a temporal paradox, because recently, some years ago, there were footprints discovered in Poland, the so-called Zachelmi tracks, and they show evidence for four-legged land-walking animals which are 10 million years earlier than even the most fish-like assumed ancestors of four-legged animals like Oystenopteron, which you see above on the left side, which still looks like a kind of salmon. This is 10 million years younger than those footprints. So the four-legged animals appear out of nowhere in the Devonian. Same pattern. It's suspicious. How is it with insects? My own field of expertise. If we look at winged insects, which make up most of the species on our animal species on our planet, here in this graph you again see all the different categories of winged insects. That would be dragonflies, mayflies, butterflies, beetles, locusts, and so on, cockroaches. And these different groups appear out of nowhere at the border between the lower and the upper Carboniferous, about 320 million years ago. And the striking thing is it's not just so-called primitive forms that appear out of nowhere, like dragonflies or mayflies or locusts or roaches, but even those insects that have this complete metamorphosis, where the larva has a resting stage, then the pupa, where the whole larval body, which looks totally different than the adult body, think of a caterpillar and a butterfly, is dissolved into a kind of soup, cell soup in this resting stage, and then rearranged to the total different adult stage, a miraculous procedure, miraculous mechanism. How did this develop? Did it take 500 million years of evolution? No, you find it together with the earliest winged insect. That is unexpected from a Darwinian point of view. And if we look at the next geological age, the Triassic, there we find, and that starts about 250 million years ago, there we find a kind of carpet bombing of different explosions. And that's not just me saying this. There's a famous paleontologist, Peter Ward, who once had a debate with Steve Meyer. He's an ardent critic of intelligent design, total evolutionist Darwinist. He wrote a book which has a suspicious title, Out of Thin Air. What could he mean by this? And he said the diversity of Triassic animal plants is analog to the diversity of marine body plants that resulted from the Cambrian explosion. It was as important for the life on land as the Cambrian explosion was for marine animal life. Same pattern again. See a pattern there. Also, if you look at tetrapods, all the first representatives of the lineages that belong to mammals, to the lizard relationship, to the crocodile lineage, to the turtle lineage, to the dinosaur lineage, all appear suddenly in the Triassic. If we look at marine reptiles, and most of those groups are extinct, we find a transition from no marine reptiles to 15 different families of marine reptiles within a few million years in the Triassic. And you can see here just a little sample of the diversity of different body plants. Some of them look like fish, some of them look like turtles, others look like manatees or like crocodiles, and they all appear without precursors suddenly in the early Triassic fossil record. Same with gliding and flying reptiles, including the first active flyers, the pterosaurs. And even with dinosaurs, and there was recently an interesting paper published in one of the Nature journals, and the lead author in the press release said there was an explosive increase in dinosaur abundance in the Triassic. It's amazing, that is literal quote, it's amazing how clear-cut the change from no dinosaurs to all dinosaurs was. That doesn't really sound like gradual, slow Darwinian development, does it? We find the same in mosasaurs, which is a marine group of monitor lizard-like animals that grew up to sizes of 15 meters length. And you might think, well, that could be Darwinian evolution. It's just a monitor lizard getting bigger and the limbs are a little bit reduced to fins. But actually we have well-preserved fossils which show that they had adaptations in their soft parts that are similar to adaptations of whales. For example, the question if bronchi are having a common stem or are split. This is preserved in some of those fossils and show they have complex adaptations that required certain mutations to appear and spread in the population. How could this happen in these short windows of time where these animals appeared out of nothing in the Cretaceous? We're now in the Cretaceous, in the Mesozoic era, getting a little bit closer to the modern time. And in this Cretaceous, there was an event that was even recognized by Darwin as a problem. He called it an abominable mystery. And it's the sudden appearance of flowering plants. They appear, and this is again a quote from a mainstream paper by Oskin et al., flowers sprang forth during the Cretaceous period as fully formed as Aphrodite. No precursors in the previous layers. All alleged Jurassic and Triassic flowering plants have been dismissed by the experts. There are a lot of fossils found in China, and a good colleague of mine who's working on those fossils says that there is now even a little bit politically incorrect name for these fossils. They are called the Wangiosperms, the angiosperms from China, which then a year after publication get recognized as just gymnosperms, which have been misidentified. There are no universally recognized angiosperms prior to the early Cretaceous. They appear suddenly in the fossil record. And Darwin was aware that is exactly the opposite from the prediction of his theory, and he was aware this is something that needs an explanation. The same is with butterflies. They appear suddenly in the Cretaceous. The same is with modern birds, where all the lineages of modern birds appear suddenly in the lower Tertiary. And it has been called by mainstream evolutionists the Tertiary Big Bang of birds. We have a rapid radiation of placental mammals, which would be modern animals with a placenta, which give living birth like humans do. And we find, if you look at this graph, this is showing the most modern phylogenetic tree of mammals, based on phylogenomics, on DNA studies, most modern molecular clock datings. The horizontal axis is the time. The branching is based on these DNA comparisons. And you see that all the fossil record, all the red dots are found in this narrow yellow range at the lower Tertiary, and none are found where they are predicted by the molecular clock datings. And that is another mystery. Why is there this discrepancy between the actual data from the fossil record and the predictions from evolutionary theory and the molecular clock datings? It's not just in this group, it's basically all the time. They never agree. These datings are always off orders of magnitude compared to the actual fossil record. And what we find with these different groups of mammals in the early fossil record is that from the early time on, they have the distinctive characters of their group. For example, the oldest bat, which you see above, and a modern bat skeleton below, basically indistinguishable. There's even evidence in the oldest bats for echolocation in the ear capsule. So why didn't this originate step by step? Where are all these gliding squirrel-like intermediates that should be expected to be found, even though we have layers that could preserve vertebrate fossils prior to this time? But there's nothing there. But what about us? So maybe you think, well, there are these ape-man-like fossils from Eastern Africa. Don't they show this kind of gradual development of humans from Australopithecine ape-like precursors? But actually, the mainstream experts say, no, there is no continuity. Here's a quote from a paper from Hawkes, John Hawkes, one of the most famous paleoanthropologists, experts for the human fossil record, and he wrote in a paper in 2000, in sum, the earliest Homo remains differ significantly from Australopithecine in both size and anatomical details. Insofar as we can tell, the changes were sudden and not gradual. So, how has this been called in the press release of this research? The Big Bang theory of the origin of the genus Homo. And even if we look at our cultural evolution, I've plotted here in this diagram a comparison between evidence for just tool-making behavior, just making stone tools to cut meat, and evidence which you see in yellow, that would be green, would be tool making, and evidence in yellow, which would be evidence for symbolic behavior. Think of cave paintings, ivory carvings, making jewelry, and so on. First musical instruments like bone flutes, and all these evidences accumulate in a time that is called the Upper Paleolithic, about 40 to 50,000 years ago. And even with the most modern discoveries of caves in South Africa, the mainstream experts agreed that it's still true that there was something that has been called the Upper Paleolithic human revolution, or the creativity explosion in the development of modern humans, which is, by the way, what we should expect if human exceptionalism and the biblical view of human origins is true. Now, something totally different, and then I will make it very brief. What about the lower taxonomic categories, the species level? Is there evidence for gradual transitions? Actually, even most young Earth creationists wouldn't have problems to say, well, Darwin finches on Galapagos could originate by Darwinian processes. But even there, all the evidence for gradual transition in the fossil record that was available and was presented in textbook as evidence for gradual development of one species into the other has collapsed in the past years by new evidence. So one example is these marine unicellular organisms, the foraminifers. There was a famous textbook example. Actually, there were only 3 major textbook examples for the species-to-species transition development. And a recent study showed evidence for abrupt speciation in a classic case for gradual evolution. It was refuted by looking more closely at the different species, and it was discovered there are cryptic species, hidden species that only gave the appearance of a transition. The other example were snails from the Steinheim Basin, the Tertiary Basin from the Miocene in Germany, and actually paleontologists from the 19th century reconstructed with these different snail shell types from this paleo lake the first evolutionary tree with actual fossils that supposedly proved Darwinian species evolution. Now, there was early criticism of people who supposed maybe these different shell types do not represent different species, but just different shell forms of the same species in the same lake, like you can have certain flowers that have a different growth type if they grow in the mountains or in the lowlands. That is called ecophenotypic plasticity. And actually, there has been a recent study at the Tibetan Plateau of the same snail genus. It's still existing. What did they find? They found in the Tibetan lake exactly all these different shell types by genetic analysis belonging to exactly the same species living in the same lake, just in different ecological zones of this lake. And they make the direct connection that this refutes that these different shell types were representing different species, so the whole tree is made up. And the final example for gradual species-to-species evolution was from a supposed human ancestor, the transition from Australopithecus anamensis to Afarensis. Afarensis would be the species of famous Lucy fossil. And it was assumed, well, these two species graded into each other, but then there was this skull discovered just 2 years ago, and the dating by radiometric dating showed that both species coexisted for more than 100,000 years, so one did not evolve into the other, and this was refuted as well, which was also explicitly said in the mainstream paper itself. So all 3 examples evaporated. And it's a general pattern. There was a paper in the Darwin year in 2009 which looked at all the progress in our knowledge of species-to-species transition in the fossil record in 150 years of research after Darwin. It was this paper by Hunt in 2010. And if you look at the quote from this abstract, it's quite revealing. He says, the meandering and fluctuating trajectories captured in the fossil record. And now comes the nod, the kowtow to the Darwinian narrative. They are not inconsistent with the centrality of natural selection as an evolutionary mechanism, but they probably would not have been predicted without the benefit of an empirical fossil record. Now, if you cut out the Darwinian doublespeak, it means what we really found is meandering, fluctuating chaos, not a trajectory from one form into the other. and this would not have been predicted by the theory. It's contrary to the predictions of the theory. So the data, again, contradict, refute, basically, the theory. So we find discontinuities everywhere on all levels, and this is admitted by mainstream evolutionists. I was attending a conference here in 2016, the famous Royal Society conference, New Trends in Evolutionary Biology, and there the keynote speaker was an Austrian theoretical evolutionary biologist, Gerd Müller, and in his talk he had a very revealing slide, which you may or may not have heard of before, where he showed 5 explanatory deficits of Darwinian theory. The explanatory deficits mean what the theory cannot explain, and the slide is titled Explanatory Deficits of the MS Theory. MS stands for modern synthesis, which is just a synonym for neo-Darwinism. It cannot explain phenotypic complexity, complex new organs. That's bad, that's macroevolution. It cannot explain phenotypic novelty, so the biological creativity. That's bad, that's macroevolution. And it cannot explain non-gradual forms of transition, what I have shown you before in the fossil record. The actual data of the fossil record cannot be explained with Darwinian theory. That is admitted by mainstream biology. So what follows from all this, to close my talk, is all the evidence points against the predictions from the theory, and usually you should then reconsider your theory if there is such a consistent pattern of conflict. Of course, you don't throw out the theory with the first anomalous data, but when you have such a consistent conflict of data, then you should reconsider the theory, and you can make an inference to the best explanation. What can explain the data? And we know that the activity of a conscious, intelligent agent would predict discontinuities, would predict bursts of biological novelty and creativity, and therefore I would suggest intelligent design as a better explanation for the fossil record. It's not just we're showing that evolutionary theory has a problem, it's a positive case for design as well. Thank you.